Okay, so hello and welcome back to your future. Today I've got a slightly different video. So rather than the usual politics and podcasts, today what this is going to be is a sort of introduction and a sort of advice video about studying Thomas Hobbes. So as a second year PPE student, I've done a lot of Thomas Hobbes. It's basically what I've been doing for the 2 years that I've been here. And I think a lot of people who try and study Hobbes have a lot of the same problems. So what I'm going to go through is sort of general misconceptions, some tips on how to read Hobbes and how to interpret it, and sort of what to look out for when you are trying to study him. So first of all, some of the difficulties people struggle when trying to do Hobbes. First of all, would be definitely that since it's older philosophy, I think it's like 1600s roughly, it can be really hard to read. That's a common problem that people seem to witness, and it's very fair. I mean, it's in old-timey English, which is really difficult to read. It's very different to actual modern English. But as well as the fact that Hobbes, particularly, but a lot of philosophers around this time have sort of difficulties with their writing styles, in that there'll be like very important quotes or phrases that'll be on completely different chapters about totally different points which are relevant to what you're trying to read. So you sometimes feel like, unless you read the whole entire book, you're going to be stranded in the water, but that's not the case. There are a few tips and tricks you can sort of go through. Number one, I reckon it's relatively obvious, but some people don't really try and do this, is that don't do your reading or don't read Hobbes without having done the lecture first. It sounds pretty obvious, but I think this applies to all philosophy, but Hobbes especially, in that it's going to be a bit hard to try and figure out what Hobbes is trying to say when reading him. So, but if you have done your lecture and you know sort of the basic arguments, you know what the premises are and what the conclusion is, you know what he's trying to get to, it can really help you actually try and understand it. It's the same way it's like you get a treasure map. You got to know what the treasure is in order to actually follow it. You got to know where you're trying to get to, is what I would say. And by doing this, it sort of means that certain phrases which seem a little bit random at points, or that wouldn't entirely make sense when put into context of what he's trying to do, make way more sense. That would be my first point of advice. And after that, that doesn't really work. Still a lot of things you're struggling with. I think the best thing you can do is simply just read it over and again. So if there's a paragraph you're stuck on, just read it a couple times, and eventually you will get it. Because I think a lot of times what people try and do is they read a paragraph and they go, "This doesn't make sense. I'll just move on." But the problem is the phrases and words that you didn't get in that paragraph will become recurring, and they'll be said very different times, and oftentimes in different contexts, and it will just snowball into chaos. And then it's just going to get worse and worse to the point where you literally you don't know what anything means. So I would say definitely try and have a basic understanding of the arguments themselves from lectures and from other sources before you try and read him, and then also reading things several times. You're better off doing a few pages but you get it than 2 chapters and not getting any of it. So first of all, a little brief introduction to what Hobbes is saying. So when you study Hobbes, most of what you're doing is the Leviathan, and basically what the Leviathan's point is an establishment of a need for a government of pretty much absolute power. So the argument begins by this. First of all, it's the state of nature. So what the state of nature is in itself is a bit of a contested topic. However, generally what it means is in a society without rules, without a government, without, I guess, institutions, essentially. A society where there's no political institutions, is generally people mean when they say state of nature. And what Hobbes does is he attempts to establish how awful a state of nature would be. How awful life would be without institutions. So he describes it as, the famous solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I'm sure the joke that most people have heard if they've studied Hobbes being that, if the first 4 of those are true, then the last one, short, would be a gift. And then by establishing through several different arguments why that would be bad, he then brings on to say this is why we need a Leviathan or a sovereign. So and what this would be is basically a government with absolute authority. And the idea is that as long as this government is providing a situation or a, I guess, environment which is better than the state of nature, i.e. better than a state of constant panic and constant death and threat of your life, then that state is legitimate, and you are duty bound to obey it basically under all circumstances. So it's quite an extreme doctrine. So that's basically the core idea. Is that state of nature is really bad. A government, even one which is extremely tyrannical, will be better. So therefore, that is necessary, and you are duty bound to obey it. That's one of the most basic ideas. That really helps people when they try and step into Hobbes, because if you kind of get what he's trying to do and you get the process, it will help a lot. I'll go into a bit more about certain premises and stuff soon, but next I want to go into some common misconceptions about Hobbes. So a lot of people when they study Hobbes, there's a lot of things that they kind of grasp at, they hear a phrase and they go, oh, okay, and they sort of apply that to everything. And there's a lot of things where even, especially in the first few weeks studying him, you'll think is true, or even your lecturer might even say is true, which really isn't. So first of these I would say is that a lot of people think that Hobbes thinks that you always have to obey the sovereign under all circumstances. And whilst I probably said that earlier on, that isn't actually the case. There are a few circumstances in which you can disobey the sovereign. The most predominant one being that if the sovereign is threatening your life directly. So the thought process behind this is relatively simple. If the whole point of the state of escaping the state of nature through a Leviathan is to protect your life, then if the state is threatening your life, then you have no duty and you have no obligation to obey them, because they're threatening what the whole point of their existence is to protect your own life. So the sovereign can't command you to kill yourself, and the sovereign can't command you to do anything which would directly impede basically your own living. That's born out of Hobbes' basic belief that self-preservation is the main drive of humanity, which goes on to the second main misconception about Hobbes, which is that a lot of people, when they talk about philosophy in a general sense, they ascribe Hobbes as a very pessimistic thinker. Say that he thinks humans are all inherently selfish and awful and horrible. Whilst really that isn't true. A lot of people think that he thinks people are stupid, selfish, and evil inherently, which really isn't the case with Hobbes. It's almost more the opposite. Hobbes's ideology is based very heavily, and his human psychology is very heavily on two things: on self-preservation and rationality. These two things are obviously linked in that he thinks that it's rational for one to want to preserve their own lives, and that all actions are taken from a basis of rationality in order to achieve this aim. So Hobbes thinks rather than humans are stupid or anything, that we are actually irrational. We are rational. It's just that we are rational in our aim to try and preserve our own lives. And that leads to negative outcomes. So, if it kind of manifests in the way that Hobbes technically is a liberal thinker. A lot of people wouldn't say that because you wouldn't think that because he basically tries to argue for a fascist state in a sense, but that's more of a consequence than an actual aim. He's liberal in a lot of senses in terms of things like he thinks that all people are born equal, for example. I think the only differences between people are very small physical differences. But no, he thinks that pretty much it's that humans are mostly rational, and that's why the state of nature would be bad. The three main points causing the sort of conflict in the state of nature, where there's nothing to intervene in our actions, would be, he says, competition, so competition of resources, diffidence, so lack of trust for others, and glory. And all of these motivations he bases entirely on rationality, not on, anger or any sort of, emotion. He bases them entirely in a rational context. So, for example, competition makes sense, probably the most rational one, and we would say it's rational to, try and attain things and, limited resources, blah, blah, blah. Since they're limited resources, you're going to compete for them. That will cause conflict. Pretty simple. Diffidence, you won't trust someone. So he argues that since there's no sort of overarching force to stop you from betraying a deal or going back behind someone's back, that there's no way deals could be formed, and you're always going to not trust someone. And that the most rational way for you to protect yourself is to strike first, because you always think they might, which will obviously breed violence in Hobbes' mind. And then there's also the idea of glory. So glory is the weird one. Glory is the one that people most ascribe to irrationality. So a lot of time when you study Hobbes, when people think vainglory, these are the people who are just going out for violence for violence sake. The ones who are doing violence just for the sake of doing it. People tend to think that, Hobbes is where he kind of puts his little, a little addition for people being irrational. It's all these people are obviously rational. They want competition. Well, they don't want there's competition. There's diffidence. And this is where the crazy people are who are just doing it for the sake of it. But that's really not the case. So Hobbes talking about glory in terms of reputation. He argues that a strong way to defend yourself and to ensure that no one attacks you is to establish a reputation for yourself as being, unable to be messed with. An ultimate fighter or a destroyer of worlds, something ridiculous. Even if it's false, Hobbes says that having a reputation is good, and the best way to get a reputation is to do violent acts. And to sort of establish yourself as this, overarching force where no one would want to mess with you. So those are the three sort of motivations that Hobbes argues are going to cause conflict in the state of nature, and it's important to always remember that they're based off of rationality. Hobbes puts the concept of rationality central to human psychology, and whether in the end it would end in bad results, like with the state of nature ends in not a very good situation, it's still people acting rationally, and that's why in this negative situation we need to have a Leviathan. So those are a couple common misconceptions. Now we're going to go into some of the key concepts that are important to keep in mind. So obviously one of the most important ones would be competition, difference, and glory. That's always important to see in terms of why he argues state of nature would be bad, which is obviously a big part of Hobbes. Those are the three main reasons. And then there's obviously other concepts that link into these. For example, the equality amongst all people. So for example, he thinks that anyone can kill everyone. You can even get to the old adage, everyone sleeps. Even someone who's tiny can kill someone who's absolutely massive and huge because everyone sleeps, everyone's distracted, people can work together in a sense. There's loads of things like that. Another important one is basically what a Leviathan is. So the Leviathan is a monarch of sort. It could be a monarch, but any sort of government which has absolute authority, and its power can't be divided is another important one. It has to have absolute power over everything, but it can't compel you to kill yourself or do anything that would directly inhibit your survival, because the whole purpose of a Leviathan existing is to ensure you are alive. And another premise when you could disobey the sovereign would be if they're not doing their duty. So if the sovereign isn't essentially making society better than a state of nature, then you have no obligation or duty to obey them because they're not doing, I guess, their job. Another key concept, I think, which is very important, which is one that I often get tripped up in still, is that so like I said there, if I guess what I wanted to say was, if the Leviathan or the sovereign isn't holding up their side of the deal, then you could break it off. But that's not what it is. I think this is the most common one, and probably the hardest one to get your head around, is that the agreement, in a sense. So you would think that from the state of nature to the Leviathan, you make a deal with whoever you're going to put in charge. They're in charge. You give them authority, and then you can take it back at any time if they're breaking certain rules, right? But it's not an agreement between you and the sovereign. The agreement is between all people in society. So the idea is that everyone comes together and they make a covenant bond with each other, and they say, right, this sucks, this is the worst, everyone's dying, we need to move out of this, and the only way that we can move out of this and be happy and not miserable and not die constantly is to form this sort of, to establish a Leviathan. And that's why the deal isn't between these people and the Leviathan. The deal is between the people themselves, which to Hobbes is important because it means it allows the sovereign to have this absolute authority that they, in theory, need to maintain, I guess, their the political obligation needed to maintain order, in a sense, and prevent this sort of chaos. That's a little bit of a tough one to get wrapped your head around, but it's important to remember because that's an easy one that you can get an essay and get wrong, and you'll easily make a mistake. Which is important. So those are sort of the key ones in a sort of brief overview. So I would say when you're trying to read Hobbes, if you're reading about why the state of nature is bad, keep competition, difference, and glory in mind. Those are the big three. And keep rationality in mind. And when you're reading about the Leviathan, and if you're doing more of a political philosophy side of it, or I guess more philosophy of freedom issues, where what freedom is, the most basic definition is that Hobbes has an odd definition of freedom, in that he sees freedom as motion. So to Hobbes, most of us would say that, freedom is the ability to do things, for example, but to achieve things or to simply act. To Hobbes, freedom is purely motion. So if you throw a rock off a cliff, it is free until the point in its motion until it hits the ground. So it's a very, very rudimentary, very basic view of freedom, which is and in a state, according to Hobbes, one would be free so long in any way, and one is free in every situation unless the sovereign has commanded against it. So you're free to do something unless the sovereign's told you not to do it, essentially. And that sort of one helps you understand some of the more freedom side of it, if that's what you're doing an essay on. But it also can help you sort of contextualize his views on the Leviathan's power, because it's basically not an issue, in terms of they have extreme power over pretty much everything. And then a good couple thinkers that people should be doing. So if you're trying to write a Hobbes essay around any topic, really, there's a few common thinkers that are easy to bring up and are good ones to sort of an introduction to challenging Hobbes. So first one's John Locke. He challenged Hobbes directly several times. He is a strongly contrasting view of the state of nature, which is very useful because, if you're trying to write an essay on the state of nature, it's nice to have a counterpoint. John Locke's two treatises of government is probably the best one you can have, and he sort of believes in liberty and the rights of people and the ability of people to cooperate even without some sort of overarching force, I guess, enforcing it. Another good thinker, which is actually one of my modules, these two thinkers together, would be Rousseau. Rousseau, again, directly challenges Hobbes on several things, and they have very contrasting opinions on the state of nature and sort of freedom. So Rousseau either, I believe it's the Discourse on Inequality, the Origin of Inequality, or Emile, Emile, I believe, are the two main ones in which you could use to sort of challenge Hobbes. Also, the social contract, to be fair, I believe, is a paper called The Social Contract. That's really good as well if you're doing sort of the transition between state of nature to the Leviathan. That's sort of one of the main things, because there's different things for each bit. And I would say studying Hobbes is 3 sections, really. It is... I would say, it's the best way to think about Hobbes overall is to think of it as in 3 sections. So it's the state of nature section, him trying to establish why state of nature would be bad and why we need to get out of it. Section 2 is definitely that sort of transition stage. So how do we get from state of nature to a sovereign or a government? And then section 3 is the more freedom side of it, and it is how would the Leviathan govern? What obligations does one have to obey them? When can we not? And those sort of things. So yeah, that's what I'd say would be my brief overview and introduction to Hobbes. Like I said, whenever you're studying each section, try and keep the sort of premises and points in mind. And always, I would say, general philosophy is keep the conclusion of, always think what they're trying to do. Always try and keep in mind what this philosopher is trying to do. That's, I think, the most important thing to understand when you're trying to learn about philosophers. What are they trying to prove? What are they trying to aim? What's their goal? Because then you can fit things in. You can start piecing things together. You know, like a puzzle, you have the final picture, and then you can start putting things together. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. If you enjoy this sort of brief philosophy introduction, I can do many more about other people. Give it a like, a comment, all that sort of rubbish. If you want more videos, subscribe. I'll put more effort into them. No, thank you so much for listening. If you have any more questions, please just ask below. Good luck. Thank you very much.